Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, faculty members, dear friends and guests of the American University Kiev. Welcome to yet another exceptional session of the AUK Talks, which over the last year and a half have really become the flagship online event of our university, and we have hosted over the course of those months really the makers of and influencers of global public opinion, presidents, ambassadors, generals, politicians, journalists, world-renowned speakers. So tonight, it is my distinct privilege and honor to welcome for the third time since last December, since December 2022, a great friend of American University Kiev, a great supporter of Ukraine, Baroness Catherine Ashton. The Right Honorable Baroness Catherine Ashton served as the European Union's first High Representative of Foreign Affairs and Security Policy from 2009 to 2014. And she was leading global level negotiations such as the P5+1 talks on Iran's nuclear program, as well as the agreement between Serbia and Kosovo. Previously, Baroness Ashton served as the first woman commissioner for trade in the European Commission and the first woman British European Commissioner. She's a live peer in the British House of Lords. She's a former nominee also for the Nobel Peace Prize, among many other awards in recognition of her illustrious career in global diplomacy and security. And she has served as a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center since 2017. Tonight, we're gonna focus on a topic which is extremely important for our Ukrainian audience, as well as for the European audiences as a whole, and it is the winding path to EU accession and the road to victory for Ukraine. What is the European strategy for winning the wars and securing the peace? We have many issues to explore and unpack. Obviously, the politics of accession, the challenges of the changing political landscape in the EU, the economic and technical challenges that Ukraine faces, and then, of course, how the accession process might impact the ongoing conflict. Would it help the EU end this terrible war and launch the reconstruction of Ukraine? And before we start and I give the floor to Baroness Ashton, let me remind everyone that today Ukraine received a wonderful news, a great gift from the European Union. The funding was announced that amounts to 50 billion euros for the next 4 years. And what an auspicious coincidence with our event. So with this, Kathy, you're more than welcome, always welcome. You have the floor, and please enlighten us.
Mark, it's wonderful to be here again and to be talking to students and faculty. And I send you all my very, very best greetings. It's great seeing all the applause and the balloons going off about the news from Brussels. I am truly delighted that there is a recognition that even though, as we know, there are a lot of things going on, that Ukraine remains a central part of the thinking that is happening between the institutions and the member states. But I wanted to just take us through in the next sort of 25, 30 minutes, and I look forward, as you know, very much to the questions, because it's always, for me, interesting to see what people are most interested in. But I want to be clear with you that this is a really important time, because what is happening in Ukraine and what will be the outcome for Ukraine is about the future of Europe. It's about its shape, it's about its capacity to determine its own future, and it's also about the reality that we face of living with Russia next door to Ukraine, but on the same land. And when we think about the future, that has got to be a part of our thinking, is how on earth do we manage this for the future? So as much as you are incredibly important as a nation, I want you to understand that you're incredibly important as a nation because you're also part of the future of all of us. And therefore, what is being done in terms of support is fundamental to the future of Europe. And you should see it in that light as well. Not see it just as a gift for you, but actually because you're very, very important to the future. And that's a distinction I want to make, that you are part of the future of Europe and therefore need to see yourselves in that context. I remember 2009, when I was appointed, the Secretary of State at that time was Hillary Clinton. And she said to me from the very beginning, you must not forget about Ukraine. You must not forget that what happens in Ukraine is going to be of such importance. And I don't think in 2009 there was as much understanding or recognition of that. We wanted strong relationships with Ukraine, of course, but we didn't see necessarily right across Europe that Ukraine would be a member at that point. You were a neighbour, you were an important part of the framework, especially when it came to the association agreement. But as you know, the agreement that was negotiated for 7 years was not a membership agreement. It was, in the first instance, about collaboration on trade, collaboration on institutional renewal. It was a way of bringing Ukraine much closer, but it wasn't specifically about membership. I think Hillary Clinton recognized where this journey would be, probably long before quite a number of people in the European Union. That's not to say that there were countries who were already saying, in the end, this has got to be about membership for Ukraine. What I'm really saying is that I don't think we had, those years ago, the depth of understanding and thinking about it. So while I say it's about the future of Europe and its shape and its capacity to determine its future, of course, it's also about the challenges that we face in developing a new security architecture. Clearly, NATO is fundamental and central to that. And that means we're also heavily reliant on the United States for its support and also for its leadership. And that's important to recognize as we think about how we're going to develop for the future the opportunity to have a strong relationship with Ukraine as a member state, but also as part of that alliance, if that is where Ukraine chooses to go, which, as I understand it, is undoubtedly at this point a decision that has already been taken. It means too that for Europe, we need to think not just about all of the elements of membership, but also to make sure that Ukraine has the capacity to win the war. It is fascinating to me that despite all that has been thrown at Ukraine, you have returned to Ukraine. I think it's 54% of the land that was stolen when this war began. Extraordinary achievements. I know people start talking about words like stalemate, but we should reflect actually that where we are is a quite extraordinary moment of achievement. So as the EU has moved forward in thinking about Ukraine, not just as a neighbour, not just as an association agreement partner, but absolutely the clarity of understanding that this is a future member state that we need to find a way to bring into the European Union properly and effectively in good time. And one of the challenges that people in Ukraine will understand well is how long it can take. It's not an easy process. We call this a winding road, and it's a very good description of what has to happen. It's not easy, even in times that are relatively peaceful and relatively secure. Doing what we call the acquis is extremely difficult. Making the economy fit with the EU is not easy. Dealing with corruption, the lack of efficient systems, changing the bureaucracy, changing the law, making sure that business is able to operate effectively on what we call the level playing field. These are all difficult things to be done. I can remember working as a justice minister in Britain when we were a member state with the judges in Romania and Bulgaria who were looking at how their judicial system had to fit in with EU law. and we had judges talking to judges, being able to discuss and debate as like-minded people, obviously working within their own judicial framework, to have that opportunity to talk to each other and to discuss with each other. And in many walks of life, in many of the different areas that will need to change, business included, there will be, I hope, opportunities for businesses to talk to each other, to be able to discuss how it works, to be able to, if you like, take some shortcuts, because there's nothing like people who've already done a long and difficult process to save time for someone else going through that same process. So I know that other member states will be willing and able to give as much advice and support as possible, but it is still a huge undertaking, and I'll say more of that in a minute. But I also wanted to talk about the implications for the European Union. And I do this not in a sense to make anyone think that it won't happen, but just to talk about some of the things that they will have to think about, and why you may get a process for Ukraine and for others around the time that Ukraine comes into membership. I think of the Western Balkans, Moldova, Georgia, others who are interested and keen, and some of whom are already on the journey. You may find the process is slightly different, because there will be a strong desire to bring people into the EU as quickly and as easily as possible, while recognizing there are many things to be done. So let's just have a few minutes on the implications for the EU. Ukraine, of course, is a huge country. You're 2.5 times bigger than the United Kingdom, and I think you're 1.7 times bigger than Germany. So you'll be the biggest nation of the European Union. That means the EU needs to rethink all of the way that it structures itself. And in a way, some of the issues, or let's call them problems, because they're problems to be solved, but nonetheless, they're quite interesting issues, lie within that simple statement. Here comes the biggest member states. There'll need to be a rethink about how the structures work, especially because currently we have 6 Western Balkan countries. We have Moldova, we have Ukraine, and of course we have Turkey, which blows hot and cold, in my view, about whether it wants to be a member state, and may get closer, but may decide in the end not to be a member state. But we have potentially at least 9 countries that would want to come in. And when you look at the structures upon which the European Union operates now, they really were built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They were built for a smaller number of countries. They were built for a different size budget. They were built for different responsibilities that the institutions had pre the Lisbon Treaty, which gave more power, if you like, or centralized some elements of the work from the member states. So it's a very different picture that we'll be painting, and it will need to be thought about very carefully. For example, just think about the resources. Ukraine could be eligible for up to 96 billion euros simply in agricultural payments over the 7-year cycle of the Common Agricultural Policy. Add into that the investment that will be needed in road and rail, environmental projects, all of which comes from the cohesion funds. And this is normal for any country coming into the EU, but it will need to be of sufficient amount to be able to achieve what's necessary to bring Ukraine to the level playing field. And I'm leaving aside the war and the restructuring and rebuilding, which in a sense is a whole budget of itself. But you can quickly add all this up to end up with all of that being more than the annual budget of the EU, which is about 170 billion. So that means thinking about resources carefully and ensuring that you have adequate resources, because what you can't do is bring in a new member state and not give it the resources to be able to manage the process of coming in and becoming a member state that is able to, in the best sense of the word, compete with others. It takes time. Nobody would suggest that all the member states of the EU have an equivalent economy, have equivalents in terms of some of the things that we'd wish to see, the opportunities that they can provide for people and so on. But the ambition is to try and get there. That means looking at how the structures are formed. It means looking at very basic things like, does everybody get the same vote? Do we carry on with unanimity of voting in every aspect of the EU? Do we have a commissioner for each country? What are they going to do? Do we need to just expand the existing organizations, or do we need to change them? And the moment you get on that path, you get into the dreaded treaty change. And treaty change means opening up the treaties and changing things to enable you to be more efficient or to change the structures, because the structures are laid down in many cases in the treaties. And that brings its own challenges too, because for some countries, Denmark and Ireland for certain, you'd need a referendum to agree the treaty. And for other countries, Spain, France, and Netherlands, often they have a referendum, which is what we call advisory, that makes sure that they have an agreement. And when we tried to do a constitution some years ago, in the Netherlands and France, they voted against. And of course, we all know what happened in the advisory referendum that we all call Brexit. This is not to put anybody off. This is not to suggest that these things cannot happen or will necessarily happen in the way that I've described. But it will be important to understand that as the EU brings Ukraine into membership, it will have to make some alterations. It will have to make some changes. It will have to redefine, in a way, how some of the monies are spent, because it will be bringing in a bigger country. And of course, for the European Parliament, numbers of MEPs and so on, not just for Ukraine, but others that might come in too. So over the years that will lead to the membership, I would just say to everybody listening, you will hear a lot about this. You will wonder whether these are bureaucratic excuses to delay, to prevent Ukraine from getting in as quickly. They may seem at times to be irrelevant to the future of Ukraine and the future of the European Union. But of course, when you bind together 27 countries now, with Ukraine 28, with the others 34 or 35 countries, you need to have strong treaties, strong understanding of what the rule of law is, of how things work, and to make sure that everybody agrees to them, at least at the beginning. Because without it, when you get some of the challenging debates in places like the European Council, and you hear a lot about those, where you're looking for unanimous decisions, one of the things that is so important is that people feel that they are bound into this structure, just as indeed they're bound into the structures of NATO as well. I think one of the exciting things about Brussels, though, and it is unique, is that it is the only place on the planet where people come together with the purpose of finding a solution, not with the purpose of standing behind their national position. Sometimes, when you listen to the rhetoric coming out of the European Council, or indeed any other meeting, you may well feel that people are simply standing with their flag behind them and arguing for their own position. But the truth is that ambassadors who do a lot of the work, and the working groups that are set up on different issues, their job is to find an agreement. In a sense, it's the only place in the world where, as an ambassador, you will have failed if you simply stand behind your national position. Everywhere else, you'd be given a medal for not giving in and for being absolutely determined on your position. But in Brussels, your job is to find an answer, and your job is to find an answer with your colleagues that can work for you. It is the ultimate art of the compromise, and compromise is a word that often gets a bad press. It's often seen to be weak. It's actually a very strong word, because it's a word that says we have found a way through together, and we've found a way through that enables us to move forward. All of the work done on trade within the EU, on what happens in terms of the justice systems, the administrations, how it approaches foreign and security policy, everything is done with that word compromise. It may be everybody agrees immediately on what to do, but there are many circumstances where what you're trying to do is find the right kind of compromise that's going to make the reflection of what you want to do all the better. So over the course of time, this is going to be what Europe is having to do, what the institutional framework is having to do, while at the same time it is negotiating and working with Ukraine to bring Ukraine in. I say negotiating because there'll be lots of points when they're opening chapters and closing chapters, when you're trying to find the best way through. Of course, on all of these issues, European law must prevail. There has to be a recognition that your judicial systems, administrative systems, business, and so on, all works within that framework. But it is also about understanding that these things are not done in a day. They take time in ordinary circumstances, and the circumstances for Ukraine are exceptional and challenging and difficult. And that means it's really important that there is a dialogue that continues with all of the ability that Brussels has, and they're pretty good at this, to be able to make that happen. So the 50 billion is great, and it's the beginning, and I'm delighted about it. And it's wonderful that in the middle of what else is going on, we've seen the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, actually saying very clearly where Ukraine fits in the priorities, which is absolutely at the top of the list. And then, of course, there's the perspective from Ukraine. Many countries will tell you, and I can particularly remember Romania and Bulgaria telling me this at length, how difficult and challenging it actually is to become a member of the European Union, and how frustrating it can be as a process. And I have no doubt, with the best will in the world, that Ukraine will feel that as well. But you, of course, will have to consider big changes at a time when your country is going through this terrible, terrible conflict. The positive that I would stick and hold on to is that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to set a new path, and that the horrors and the trauma of war are the backdrop that give us a determination to make sure that you succeed. I wish it were otherwise. I wish Ukraine were coming in a peaceful and easy way. I'm saddened and horrified by the backdrop that we have. But what we do know is that this determination, this certainty of vision that extends in the political sphere is really important to do it. It's also important, I would say, that politicians across the spectrum share the same vision. There's always, as we say in Europe, an election somewhere. And although I don't see presidential elections happening early next year in Ukraine, maybe they'll have to be postponed. That is for Ukraine to decide. Nonetheless, over time, and certainly the time to full membership, Ukraine will probably see elections. It may be that it's the same president and it's the same people in parliament. It's for you, again, to decide. But it's important to make sure that there is an agreement across the spectrum about where everybody is going, and not to have people who blow hot and cold on it. I think that exists now, and I think it will be important to hang on to it. Building that commitment really does matter, because it will make sure that there is a continuity of work and a continuity to make sure that you succeed. But there are very few shortcuts, and there are always high expectations. So it will be important to do that. I want to just say a little bit more about Europe's commitment to the war, and then I'll stop and we can have a conversation. There is a really strong commitment that exists not just within the EU, but certainly within my own country, and that I hear and see manifestly across so many different parts of the world, to see Ukraine regain its territory, to create a security architecture that prevents this from happening again, and the gradual rebuilding of some kind of order that enables us to think about the future without this as the existential fear that Ukraine lives with for the next 50 years. It's a tall order to want that. It's a really challenging part of it, but it is important that we keep some level of vision onto the future. But we all know that we have to be mindful of a few things as the war progresses and as time continues. The first is to make sure that there is a a real determination for continued financial and military support. I know that as Ukraine went down the agenda on the news cycles because of the awful events of October 7th in Israel and what has happened in Gaza, and now obviously the release of hostages and the pause, that there may have been a feeling that somehow Ukraine was slipping down the agenda. I don't think that's happened, and I don't think that's true, but one has to be very aware of the need to keep the agenda alive and to keep people remembering and being determined to support Ukraine. I would also say that you will hear things about the US Congress wavering. Again, I don't think that's going to happen. I think they will put together packages of financing and funding that may seem a little strange, but at the heart of it, I think there will be support for Ukraine. But we have to keep working at it. So it's not something to be taken for granted. I don't think President Zelensky takes it for granted for a moment, but I think it's important that we're all conscious of that. The second is, of course, public opinion. People say, why is the war still going on? What's happening? And again, that's really important. It's really important that leaders in each nation are reminding the population and are making sure that they understand how important it is to keep going. We have so many wonderful Ukrainians living in many countries, including my own, who themselves are a huge asset and a huge blessing to us, because not only are they constantly reminding us, but they are people who have done so much to be part of our communities while longing to be home with their own. And I think that's to be remembered and always to be at the back of our minds, if not at the front of our minds. But third is, of course, the political scene changes all the time. I said before, there's always an election in Europe somewhere, and that's true. When I was High Representative, I was always conscious that the political setting of the different 28 countries then could change in a moment. We could get a different government, a different coalition, a different set of views. On foreign policy, in most countries, there's a pretty even chance that you will have the same basic agreement, because it's not those issues that most countries split on. They split on domestic issues, but it can happen. And we've got to be mindful that we have European elections next year. Elections in my country will make no difference to this at all. And of course, we have the American elections, and we don't know quite how that will work out. I hope it will work out with a leader who is completely supportive of Ukraine. I hope we'll have a Congress that retains its determination to support Ukraine. But we have to be conscious of what can happen. And even with what's happening at the borders now with the trucks from Poland, you can see how politics can play into people's fears or concerns and the other way around. There'll be a new government in Poland. It will be supportive, but they'll have to resolve some of these practical issues, which of course can make a big difference. And I suppose finally, it's also important that we keep some of our thinking about what happens when the war ends, and the rebuilding and the return for millions of people, reuniting communities and families who are forever changed in a way. And that's an important element that we need to think about in the context of closer to the European Union. I also always say it's important to start thinking about some of the processes and the logistics now. You know, one of the things I learned about negotiation is you can spend an awful lot of time arguing about where you're going to meet. And when you've worked out where you're going to meet, what shape the table is and who needs to sit around it. So I always urge people in Ukraine to, in their mind, think about when things start to move, and one day they will, though I have no idea when, that they're very clear about where they think, who they think, what they think should be part of that process. Because sometimes things change very quickly. Sometimes 1 week to another, and you're suddenly in a completely different situation. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible. And having worked through the things that need to happen will be important. It'll be about securing the peace. It will be about the rebuilding and reconstruction. It will be about bringing people to account, preventing future aggression, preventing this just being a pause. And of course, building a strong and secure economy that will invite people to come home and offer them opportunities. That's going to be extremely important, as well as the internal stability that will be needed for the future. Foreign direct investment, strong growing economy, absolute determination on democracy, freedom of the press, the building of institutions without any form of corruption. These are long-term objectives, but incredibly important. So it's a winding road, and sometimes on a winding road, you can't quite see around the corner. And that can be really worrying, because you think, what if around the corner there's something I'm not expecting? The good news about the EU is that you might not see around the corner, but you'll know what is around the corner. That actually the process is long and it's winding, and there's a Beatles song somewhere in there about a long and winding road. But the great thing about the road is there's an absolutely clear destination, and it will be great to welcome Ukraine as a sovereign nation making its own decisions as part of the European Union family. Thank you.
Okay, I see applause already and hearts flying. Kathy, I really appreciate your in-depth, not only analysis, but like you're giving us your vision of the future of Ukraine, really. And it's a message of hope, a message of exactly this togetherness that you spoke about, that the European Union is about. This cohesion, this ability to work together. So definitely Ukraine is and has always been a part of Europe, and it belongs to the European family of nations. So let me just ask one question before we move to the the dozen or so great questions that I already see in the chat. You spoke about the ability to compromise in Brussels at the at the ambassadorial level of represented nations, that everybody has to give up on some of their national, at least the hard stance, national positions. But what about the extreme, the extreme right or the extreme nationalist parties? Not only parties, fringe parties, but actually those that win elections and come to power. Again and again, we know who they are. Some are old, that some are old new. Some are, even obviously the U.S. is not immune in that regard. But at the EU level, could this disrupt down the road this kind of European common front for supporting Ukraine? Do you think there's any danger, or do you think this consensus is pretty stable regardless of regardless of who comes to power at various times in various countries?
Yeah, I mean, we've had over the years, the determination of a few to either get their own way or to disrupt. But they have to operate within the framework of the rules of the European Union. And back to my point about treaties and about the acquis and about the signing up to all of this. So they have to behave within that space. And they also need, for their own countries, to be able to demonstrate that they are continuing to benefit from being part of the European Union. So what you often find, and we can see this right now, is that tied into an argument that looks as if it's about Ukraine, it's actually about other aspects of their relationship with the EU. For example, freedom of the press, the role of the judiciary, things that should be happening. And if they don't happen, then monies don't get given, don't get dispersed, they're held back. And so what sometimes happens is they will try and take hostage another issue, and that will sometimes be Ukraine. You will see that, and it's not much to do with you, it's more to do with what else is going on in Brussels. But Brussels is really good at dealing with that too. And if there is a weight of member states and a determination to move forward, you'll find that they find a way to do it. So Brussels is always very open and very noisy and very obvious. There's no secretive meetings because everybody gives a press conference. and everybody gives their personal perspective because it's a domestic audience. But nonetheless, by being part of it, there is only one way to go forward. And I think it will be necessary as part of this rethinking a bit the framework to find ways to better deal with those who hold things up. And I'm sure they will.
Okay, that's fair enough. Definitely, the European mechanisms are working, as we just saw, and I even read some of the communiques or statements that were made that even if one nation tries to block, for example, this major package, a mechanism has been elaborated so that all the other members that are for this step, they can actually pool their funding efforts together and kind of creating a detour around this roadblock, and then provide the package even against the objections of that certain nation. Okay, many good questions, over a dozen in the chat. Some have been sent to me earlier. So let me start with two that relate to negotiation strategies. One is directly asking you, what should, which real status quo should Ukraine be guided in when the time comes to reach some sort of a peace agreement? Is it the 91 borders, the 2014, or maybe leaving aside a peace treaty, just like Japan and the Soviet Union did not really have a formal peace treaty? So what would be your advice on negotiating peace potentially down the road? The second question is linked to the Cypriot example. Obviously, Cyprus still has unresolved territorial disputes and issues, but nonetheless, it was admitted, it acceded to the European Union in 2004. So there's been talk and speculations and ideas thrown in the public space that maybe if Ukraine leaves for now some of the territories, and it's a highly controversial issue, but it exists in the public space. Maybe this way it could be accepted the way Cyprus was. So what do you think of that?
So in the public space, lots of people will have lots of different ideas, and some of them will not work. Some of them will be unacceptable, all of that. The good news is it's important to have people thinking, even if what they think doesn't make any sense or to you or you couldn't see happening. On the Cyprus question, it's hard to think that the EU would do that again, because importing an unresolved issue, though Cyprus is not Ukraine, sometimes it's harder to resolve it from the inside than it is from the outside. And we haven't been able to resolve it, which makes life a bit more complicated. Having said that, the only people that can decide how Ukraine is and what Ukraine is Ukraine. And there's always going to be lots of ideas about leaving this bit behind or not having that bit. Crimea, should it be in or out? Is it a bargaining chip? Is it not? What happens in the Donbass and so on? Of course, people will wonder and think, especially when it's hard to know when the war will end, and nobody knows that yet. But it's entirely got to be for Ukraine to determine how it wishes its sovereign state to be. And the most important thing is that it has to feel that it is Ukraine. I hope it is all of Ukraine, whole and free, and able to be part of the EU in that way. If it chooses not to, if it chooses to do something else, that's for you. It's not for me. But whatever it has got to be certain and sure that it is Ukraine as it wishes to be. So the thing about the European Union is it needs borders. You need to know where it ends, where it begins. You can't do trade deals with other countries. You can't represent people if you don't know quite who you've got inside and who you've not. So it is really important that it is absolutely clear who they should be and who they wish to be, and who and how you get to that point is for you. And it's important because everybody's got lots of fancy ideas and you hear them a lot, but it really, really does come down to the Ukrainian people. You're the ones who are fighting. You're the ones who are suffering. You're the ones who have this strong determination to keep your country intact and to make it as free as possible. If you decide to do anything in a negotiation, it is for you. So it doesn't matter whether you start at 2014, whatever, we're not there anymore. We're in 2023, and a country that has got an invader on its land and needs to make sure that that ends as soon as possible.
Yeah, and of course, thank you for reminding us of the complexity of Ukraine's situation. It's not Cyprus; it's not an island where you can, it's sealed off geographically, and you have really an invader at the borders. And when Ukraine joins, it will be the outside, the external border of the European Union. So whatever border even becomes accepted, this will be sealed for decades, maybe for generations to come, if that becomes really the external border of the Union. So these are very, very serious questions. How about corruption? There are a couple of questions on how the European Union can help in practical terms to decrease corruption. And I say this, of course, and I want to remind everyone that this talk about corruption all the time, is largely due to, of course, excessive Russian information, or disinformation operations, propaganda. But obviously, corruption exists, and it needs to be dealt with. What can the EU do in practical?
Yeah, and it's not an issue that is about Ukraine. It's an issue that for many countries over many years, you've had little low-level bits of things that are corruption is a big word we give them, but they're things that have happened. They've happened in communities, in businesses. It's how people have managed contracts. It's, if you in so many parts of the world, you still see it. If you buy somebody a big enough present, it's why when I was High Representative, you couldn't receive gifts and so on and so forth. It's to protect you from it. So it's not that people have to think that Ukraine is corrupt. It's simply that Ukraine has to guard against any levels of corruption. So it is all of those things, that you can't buy a judge, you can't buy a decision, you can't buy a place for your child in school or an exam result. And in some countries I've seen, not Ukraine, that is one of the things that they had to tackle. So it's often very little areas, and it's sometimes quite big ones, where what you need to do is put in place the measures that prevent it, even if it's not there. Even if I would say as High Representative, well, nobody's going to buy me, you need to be seen not to be bought. You need to be seen not to have things done. And that's true in politicians, that you have to register your interests. People have to know when you've taken a free flight with somebody to go somewhere. When you are helping and supporting somebody, you have to say so. It's all of the things that are really important to do in every country, because every country needs to not only deal with corruption, but be seen to deal with it. So you'll hear a lot about it. It's not just about Ukraine, it's about every country trying its best to make sure that that's not an issue.
It's effectively a matter of the EU helping Ukraine help itself, or get rid of something that's used as a hybrid, weapon of influence by the aggressor. How about the steps that the Ukrainian government should take, in your opinion, to accelerate even further its integration, to accept the acquis and all the other steps? Is there anything that you think that they should be doing, or they could be doing even better to make it faster, to make it smoother?
Again, the Commission's really good at helping with officials who are experts in this, and other member states who have gone through the process. There will be areas of the acquis that are easier and quicker to do, simply because it's about aligning the law, and it's pretty aligned anyway, so it just needs a tweak. Or it's about policies that we share in common foreign and security policies, those kinds of things. So lots of things are not so difficult to do. Other things require legislation, and they require consultations and legislation. They require business processes to change. They require the judiciary to be set up in a particular way. I mean, I'm not saying that needs to happen in Ukraine, but it certainly had to happen in some other countries where you needed to make sure your court system worked effectively and people had access to it. And that meant dealing with backlogs, and that meant dealing with ensuring that people got the same justice wherever they were in the country, those kinds of things. So some of it is about straightforward procedures. Others is a bit more cultural. It's about making sure that everything happens in the same way. And it's about those two things. So as they open, as you get to the chapters, what you'll find is some open and close really quickly, some are open for ages, and some work at a medium pace. But the EU will help Ukraine move as quickly as it wishes to on areas where it's very clear that can be done. And areas where there is a lot more work to do, they will also help and support financially to make that happen. And you will have a little army of officials who will be available to come and help, which is always good. But I would also say ask some member states to help too, because they've experienced a little army of officials and may decide that they can give you some help about how to manage that as well.
Okay. Well, now that you've raised the issue, also financing and funds, obviously, and investment and the economy. There's a good question on the this $50 billion funding package, and I regret now using the word gift. It's not really a gift. It's an investment in the future, not only of Ukraine but of the European Union. But nonetheless, the question is, what do you think the European Union expects in return for this? Are there any conditions, any strings attached to this package?
I don't know. I don't have the detail because obviously it's come out of Brussels, and I knew as much as when you and I talked before that it had happened.
Okay.
But I'm not sure. I mean, as a general rule, there are always conditions in the best sense that the money is used in very particular ways for obvious reasons. The European Union is very, very good at making sure that money that it gives in any circumstances is well spent and is spent on the things that it says it should spend them on. So it will come with a whole set of things that need to be done and a whole set of ways in which the EU will make sure it was done. After all, it's taxpayers' money in Europe, so they have to answer back to the other countries and to all the taxpayers for the money that is given.
Okay. How about direct investment by European companies? You already spoke about some of the preconditions, obviously, reducing corruption, as we discussed, obviously improving security, legal changes, improvement in the legal system, in the judicial system. Any other recommendations? I mean, after all, if Ukraine doesn't want to, is not asking for gifts, as I said, it's asking for investment in its own future. So what should we do? What should they do to boost their attractiveness to Western European companies?
I mean, certainly, yeah, when the association agreement was being done, there were lots of areas. Technology, of course, agriculture. I mean, there you are, the breadbasket. And also the opportunity for some of the older industries to be able to be renewed in terms of energy and so on, and to invest in future-proofing them. So there will be a great interest in foreign direct investment from overseas companies. They will look for a couple of things. They will look for stability. So they will look to make sure that this is a country that is stable, not least because people from those organizations and companies very often come with the investment to start off the company and to employ people and so on. And companies won't do that if it's not secure. And equally, they want to protect their investment. But the biggest thing of all is rule of law. It's knowing that if they sign a contract, that it will be upheld in the courts and that they can rely on that being the justice system that exists across Europe. It may look a bit different, it may have a different language, the judges might wear different robes, they might operate in a slightly different way, but fundamentally that they can rely on the rule of law operating for them. And that is, it seems to me, the most important thing. It's not only true in the EU, it's true right across the world. Talking to countries like Egypt, when we were looking at investment by companies, the thing that the company said all the time is we need to know that the rule of law will exist. And so I think that will be an area that for business, it will be important to show them that that's happened and that that's really secure.
Okay, let's talk a bit about the potential impact of Ukraine joining the EU, and how it would potentially dilute or weaken the influence of the big players, the large players such as Germany and France. Obviously, Ukraine has now 30 to 35 million citizens. That puts it in a category of states like Spain, like Poland. You know, not the largest ones, but definitely toward the larger states in terms of countries, in terms of population. Would that play? What will be the dynamic if Ukraine joins in terms of this balance, this Franco-German, alliance of which everyone has been, so concerned sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that, in my experience, there's always a sort of center of gravity in the European Union, and it's not always to do with, just being Franco-Germany, but because if you add up all the other countries, they can outvote them and outweigh them all the time. But there is a sense that Europe has a set of values and ideals and ideas that come together around certain approaches politically. People who are vested in the European Union, who want to see it succeed. When the big enlargement took place, I was a justice minister in Britain, working with justice ministers, and we were very keen when we were the presidency to make sure that the newer member states, which was the Baltic states and Poland and Greece and so on, and Cyprus rather than Greece, that they were able to feel that they were as equal, as important, that their vote really did count as the ones who'd been there before, the original group of countries. And I hope we did something towards that. And certainly nowadays, when you think about the strength of countries like Lithuania and Poland in terms of determining how Europe behaves and operates, they're very clearly becoming more and more important. In truth, it depends on the issue. In foreign policy, I used to say I've got 28 countries, I've got an expert in the room somewhere on everything. We have histories and geographies and politics that bring people together. So what you find is that on an issue, a particular issue, some countries will be more prominent. On the issue of Russia, for example, when I was High Representative, the Baltic states, Poland, extremely important. So too Germany. Didn't always agree, but those are the countries people, including, and I guess Finland as well, those are the countries people listen to the most because their experience was very particular. So I think what you will find is that there'll be some issues where for you will look to Germany or France or Sweden or somewhere else because you know that they have a really strong view, but also they have a sort of center of gravity on it. And other issues, people will look to you. And that's as it should be, as it should be.
All right. How about the issue? I think you touched upon some of this in the beginning, but the issue of this, the sad reality of the blocking of the borders, Ukraine's borders, especially for transporting goods in and out of the European Union, and of course, it's all related not only to the trucking business, but it's primarily also about agriculture. And many countries in Europe, primarily Poland, but others, of course, will see Ukraine's producers as competitors. Could this be an obstacle? I mean, I'm not saying it will derail the negotiation, but definitely that will be a hard task to handle. What is your opinion?
Yes, it will need to be handled. I mean, domestic leaders don't become Europeans because they walk into the European Council. I used to say they, in their rucksack, that you may not be able to see, but is very definitely on their back, all their domestic problems are carried into the room. And, the farming communities, agricultural communities from France to Poland to many countries within the EU are significant and important politically, and of course, very important economically, and anything that's seen to affect their ability to be profitable and to be able to have a good living is really challenging. So it all has to be managed, and it will be. But again, it will be at times very messy. It will be very loud. There will be things like this. We've had French tractors blocking things before. We've had tractors in Brussels. All sorts of things happen when different communities feel very strongly. It's also true when you bring in other parts of the economy or you're doing a trade deal. The car industry in Germany, when I was doing the trade deal with South Korea, that was a very challenging set of discussions and negotiations to manage, because they were not very keen on having lots of Korean cars in Germany, but the Koreans were very keen on having lots of Korean cars in Germany. So these are things that have to be managed, and they will be difficult, but they will be managed. And it's partly about the use of the common agricultural monies to be able to support farmers and to support agricultural communities, especially in a big transition. And it's also about how domestic politicians play it, because the problem for every government is that there is an opposition ready to exploit whatever problems they have and ready to say, well, we would do it differently. And so you often find that it gets caught up in a sort of party political domestic arena, as well as being an issue between countries and within the EU. But the job of the EU is to solve it. So that's going to be, I think, a big challenge and a big question mark about how resources in terms of agriculture will be spent. And you will run into the problems that even though the people in Poland support Ukraine massively, if you're a small farmer thinking that you're going to lose your business and you won't be able to look after your family, that hurts you and comes home in a different way. So it's about balancing those things.
Excellent. Kathy, we really have a couple of minutes left. I know we need to let you go at the top of the hour, but let me ask you one last question about the human dimension. We've spoken about the politics, the high politics, the negotiations cycle, and all the problems, potential and current. How about the human, not only perception, but the future of Ukrainians as human beings? And the question is how would the accession to the European Union improve the lives, the welfare of the people in Ukraine? I guess I want to expand it a bit. Anti-EU, anti-European propaganda, originating from Moscow, as you know, is always talks about the high cost that the European nations give more than they receive, that the standard of living is not as high as they've expected. So what should the European Union tell its future European citizens, that is the citizens of Ukraine?
That I could say this, coming from a country that decided to get out of the European Union, that you're part of a community, the biggest trading bloc on earth, that it is about the recognition of your rights and your ideals. It is about offering certainty to people that human rights will be respected, that the rule of law will apply, that they will be given economic security, that education standards will be as high as possible, that you work within the framework of countries. We can't do it in a day. It will take years, and it does. And people get fed up because they say, well, we thought it would all be marvelous immediately, and it isn't. It takes time. But the ability to work, travel, live, to be part of this extraordinary continent, really, is something that is quite special, and nowhere else on earth does it exist, which is why people want to be part of it. And for everybody in Ukraine, they will be European, they will feel European, but they will also be Ukrainian. So you have this wonderful combination that you can be proud of your country, and rightly so, but also be proud Europeans.
What a wonderful way to end this conversation on a positive note, looking into the future with bright eyes and great ideas. You see all the hearts and thumbs up and applause is flying. Kathy, as always, this was a tour de force and a pleasure for me personally, for all of our listeners, our audience in Ukraine, and and around Europe, those who joined us from other countries. So with this, you're always welcome. We would love to the next time show you not only the virtual walls behind
the real ones. Yes, please.
Real ones. Yeah, we have a wonderful campus on the banks of the Dnipro River. It's beautiful. You're gonna love it. So let us know when you plan to be in Kiev in the coming year, and we'll host you and organize another great talk.
Thank you, Mark. And as we move to the holiday season and all that's happening, we are thinking of you all the time and wish everybody well in these really difficult times. So my very, very best.
Thank you for your heartfelt support, and again, you're always welcome to join us. To all of you, our audience, our friends and guests, thank you very much, and I'll see you tomorrow when we'll be hosting Ian Brzezinski for his talk on US politics and the support for democracy worldwide.
Bye for now.
Good night and stay safe.